I was 4 years old when my parents sat my siblings and me down and told us that they were getting a divorce. In time, I learned that it wasn't an easy one or an amicable one. It was a damaging one. I didn't understand then that this moment, this decision, was going to change who I was and define who I was going to become. And until very recently, I hadn't understood the extent to which it had affected me. But this year, at 18 years old, I started doing a lot of thinking and a lot of researching. And now that I have understood a lot about my experience, I want to show you, because this journey of self-discovery opened my eyes up to the fact that my story is not a rare one, and there are way worse ones out there. It made me realize how distortedly we perceive mental illness and trauma. It made me realize how little we talk about it and how much we need to talk about it more. And I'll tell you why. Traumatized individuals are 2 times more likely to have developed pulmonary disease. They are 3 times more likely to have depression. They are 4 times more likely to have alcoholism or a drug addiction. And they are 15 times more likely to have attempted self-harm. It is no wonder that trauma has become a hallmark of psychological study, and especially complex trauma. Now, I want you to think of trauma as a stab to the lung, immediately debilitating. You have to be sent to the emergency room for an immediate fix. And think of complex trauma as a dozen little cuts to your skin, applied daily. Not immediately debilitating, but over time, those Band-Aids that you applied will prove insufficient. And over time, they can have even worse long-term effects than regular trauma. And the thing about complex trauma is that, unlike trauma, which is a singular event, it is multiple traumatic events occurring over a period of time. And it can have devastating effects, some of which include emotional constriction, emotional dysregulation, emotional dissociation, the deformation of oneself, in which the patient feels chronic feelings of guilt and of shame. It is a lack of self-esteem and an inability to form relationships and to have trust in adulthood, and among many other effects. And complex trauma commonly occurs during childhood, because trauma is not black and white. It depends on each person's individual threshold for emotional pain. And as a child's emotional vulnerability is incomparable to that of an adult. So your emotional threshold for emotional pain is going to be much smaller. As a result, children are always much more susceptible to perceive a threat as traumatic. And I want to take a very common example nowadays, broken homes. And these many times propagate complex trauma. Being raised in a broken home can emotionally rip you apart, and I can attest to that. At 5 years old, I was forced to see my heroes, my parents, insult each other, fight with each other, emotionally abuse each other. At 6 years old, I was forced to choose sides, to believe a parent over the other, to love a parent over the other. Does that seem like an easy choice? It was an unconscious one at the time, but having to live with that choice, that's a whole different story. At 8 years old, my family began struggling financially a lot, and it only exacerbated the constant tension in our family. At 9 years old, I was forced to sit through family fights, where the only thing that was ever achieved was a growing resent. It was a competition of who screamed the loudest, who banged the door the hardest, playing the blame game, until who ended up losing? It was neither parent. It was the children having to sit and watch that ugliness ensue. At 10 years old, I witnessed my mother struggling with depression. I didn't really know what it was. I just knew that she was hurting every day. And even though I knew why, I didn't really know how to stop it. just like she didn't know how to stop taking it out on us, on me, my sisters, and my brother. At 10 years old, I overheard my mother saying in the heat of the moment that having children made her give up her life. Afterwards, she took it back and she apologized. She denied the truth in that. But to this day, I still wonder if there was ever a kernel of truth to that. How would you feel if the person that gave you life, the one person that is supposed to love you unconditionally, no matter what, tells you that they blame you for a life that they now partially resent, or a life for not having a life beyond you? At 12 years old, I began writing a book titled Living Under the Roof of My Own Bully. Now, don't get me wrong, I never, ever hated my mother, and she never intentionally harmed me, but her depression did cause her to emotionally abuse and neglect me at times. And the hardest part was that I loved her so very much. She's my mother, and she was the best mother on her good days. At 15 years old, my sister was diagnosed with depression, much as a result of her own childhood trauma. And at 18 years old, I myself realized that I had suffered psychological effects as a result of childhood trauma. Today, my parents have a good relationship, but those wounds never really healed. And I think it's time that we start accepting that our childhood, the way we were raised, our nurturing, it has a deep effect on us, one that can no longer be ignored or cast aside. And the Adverse Childhood Experiences study proved just that, or provided evidence for just that. The Adverse Childhood Experiences study, the ACE study, was conducted between 1995 and 1997 in the United States. It had over 17,000 participants of different ages, ethnicities, and educational backgrounds. And what this study did was it correlated adverse childhood experiences, such as emotional, sexual, or physical abuse, emotional neglect, parental illness, and parental separation, against health outcomes, liver disease, heart disease, hepatitis, lung cancer. And this study found a clear trend. The higher your ACE score, the higher your risk of negative health outcomes. How does this happen? How do you go from childhood trauma affecting your actual physiology, your anatomy? The answer to that lies in the leap between adverse childhood experiences and disrupted neurodevelopment. That disrupted neurodevelopment leads you to adopt health risk behaviors, which leads to that early death. Now, how do you get disrupted neurodevelopment as a result of childhood trauma? And that answer lies in your stress response. Your body has a biologically instinctual response to threats. And what happens is your hypothalamus recognizes this threat, and it sends signals to the pituitary gland, which in turn sends signals to the adrenal gland that releases adrenaline. And that adrenaline is what helps you either fight this threat or flee this threat. And this system is helpful, except for when the threat is continuous, when the adversity is constant, such as with complex trauma. What happens then is your stress response is triggered over and over and over again. And that leads you to become in an adrenalized state. In fact, studies have shown that certain synapses in your brain can actually be overexcited when they shouldn't be. All of this leads to a hormonal imbalance. And this hormonal imbalance is what affects a child's brain that is still developing and causes this neurodevelopment. Now, this is what causes the physiology to actually change as a result of adverse childhood experiences. But I want to focus on another part of the stress response that is not so commonly referred to, and that is the freeze stress response. The freeze stress response occurs when you can either flee the threat or fight the threat, be this whether you're physically restrained or if the emotional pain is so severe that your body protects you from it. And what happens then is that adrenaline that was secreted actually functions as an analgesic, and you dissociate from that moment. Now, dissociation can be compared to a long-term process of daydreaming, It is when you respond to internal stimuli instead of external stimuli, thus enabling you to face the enormity of the situation which you are facing and protect you. The thing about the freeze stress response, however, is that it can damage your hippocampus. Studies have shown that chronic stress and traumatic events can damage the hippocampus, which is the area of your brain for learning and for memory. It is essential for binding neurocortical regions that encode experiences, including those traumatic ones. So what happens is this can actually be impaired, this binding and integration function, which can lead to a disorder known as dissociative amnesia. Dissociative amnesia is the disruption of the regular integration of memory. And what happens is your brain actually blocks out a lot of your memory. You have chunks of memory blocked out, whether this be an hour, a day, a month, or even a year, depending on your own traumatic event. If you ask me about my family life before the age of 10, I will have a very hard time coming up with a concrete memory. It's not that I don't remember anything. There are obviously things that I do remember, but the family part of it, the negative experiences that I went through as a child, I do not remember. It's a blank. What I do know is what my siblings or my parents have told me, or pictures that have triggered things. And at this point, you might think of this as a silver lining. If I went through these traumatic experiences as a child and I cannot remember them, they can't hurt me. But that's not necessarily true, because dissociative amnesia does not mean that the memories aren't there. They just have not been processed properly by your brain, which means that these memories can still come out and hurt you. And more importantly, the emotions that you felt were processed, and they can be associated even in the present. If I have moments of acute stress that remind me of my childhood and my traumatic instances, I will block out and I will forget hours of that moment. I will find myself having random bouts of sadness and not know where they come from. And I realize that this might be the answer. But the truly crazy thing about this is that until this year, I had never questioned it. I never questioned why I could not remember concrete memories of my childhood life. Because I never wanted to talk about it. I thought it was shameful. I wanted to block it out and try to forget its existence. And I not only did this with myself, but with my sister too. When she was diagnosed with depression, she was taking antidepressants for a while. And at first, I didn't really know what to think about it, because as a society, we associate taking antidepressants as being embarrassing. One of her closest friends was even asking, is there anything else that she can do? And I now realize that is the wrong way to look at this. Mental illness is physiological. Depression is caused by an absence of neurotransmitters in the brain, and antidepressants produce more, and that is all. It is purely scientific, and yet there is so much stigma around it. The way that us as a society perceive mental illness has caused so many to refuse to acknowledge their illness or to refuse treatment. We often associate those that are mentally ill with being crazy. Don't you see how wrong that is? By associating the adjective crazy to those that are mentally ill, you are attributing the blame to the person and not the disorder. If someone broke their leg, would you blame them for not being able to walk? Of course not. And it goes exactly the same way for mental illness. If someone is depressed, you cannot blame them for having mood swings or for having a negative perception of things at times. We need to radically change the way that we look at mental illness. And more importantly, we need to stop blaming people for things that they have zero control over. Because we are causing people that are hurting, that are suffering, to refuse and to be ashamed to seek help. Instead, we need to start working together to remove the stigma that there exists on mental illness. My experiences are far from unique, and as I've said, there are way worse ones out there. We need to start accepting that mental illness is real, that it is common. We marginalize the issue not because it is uncommon, but because it is so common. we would rather claim that it is not our problem instead of realizing that it should be every single person's problem. We need to start empathizing with those that are mentally ill and recognize that the one thing that separates your fate from theirs is luck. And this process of removing stigma and of working together and empathizing begins with a simple thing: talking. It begins with talking openly about trauma and about mental illness without shame and without embarrassment. So let's talk. I only hope that by showing you the debilitating psychological and physiological effects of trauma and of mental illness, and by opening up, by laying myself bare before friends but strangers alike, that I can encourage others to do so as well, to open up about their story and their experiences with trauma or mental illness. Because without cooperation, without openness and communication, without acceptance and empathy, mental illness will remain a taboo. Complex trauma and mental illnesses will remain undiagnosed, and healing will remain unlikely. So, let's talk. Thank you.